In this video, we're going to work with the ZDepth passes that we just created in Maya and use them to create a depth of field effect inside of our final comp. So this version of the comp that I'm looking at right now is essentially just the basic merged version that's bringing our AOVs, our shadow passes, our background, and our ambient occlusions, or occlusion passes all together to give us this kind of base look. I haven't added any blur or grain or any of those secondary utility nodes yet to adjust anything, so this is just straight out of the renderer, kind of pre-composed, ready to go to make any of those changes. The ZDepth could be part of the equation before or after we do any of the other adjustments. The order really doesn't make a difference as long as the connections are correct. That's the advantage of node-based compositing. You can add things to the chain at different stages, and as long as you know where to place it and how to adjust it, it'll still work. So if you've already got your color corrections and things like that done at this point, don't worry. It won't really change anything as far as the ZDepth goes. So I'm going to bring in my Z. I've got that rendered out already in the previous example. We're going to be looking at the version that would have been generated had you enabled the merge AOVs option in Maya, which most of you should have done because that's what the previous assignments called for. So if you want to check to see if that's the way it ended up, all you got to do is bring in your ZDepth, which I just done. I'm going to label that right away. Instead of read1, I'm going to call it Z_depth. And I'm going to plug that into the viewer with the 1 key. And at a glance, you can see that the ZDepth path just kind of looks like the master layer from Maya, which by default, that is correct. That's all it is. However, what's different is that in the depth channel, we should have the Z information stored. So where it currently says RGBA and the channels drop down, go ahead and change that to depth. And it's red, which is kind of weird because we're expecting to see a white ZDepth channel. Don't panic, it's probably still correct. Just like in Maya, the exposure of the captured ZDepth is probably in a higher range than the monitor is going to be able to display, so we need to dial that down to make it visible. So I'm going to select my ZDepth node, hit the tab key, bring up the type in box, and type in exposure. We've looked at this node before. This is essentially a color correction node. It allows us to adjust the exposure in the image higher or lower. So if we bring the exposure down, we should be able to see the pixels of the ZDepth. So let's go ahead and try that. So exposure's plugged in. I'm going to label it Z_depth_exposure. And we're going to need to change the channels over to depth because by default exposure will always affect RGB, but we've just determined already that our depth channel is where the pixels that we need to work with exist. So you're going to have to go to the ZDepth exposure or the exposure nodes channels area and change the channels to depth. So with the depth active, now the sliders within the exposure will adjust the depth. So in this case, it's going to be too bright, again, just like in Maya. So I'm going to drag this down to the max, which is -1.023, and I still don't see a change, so obviously that's not enough. Again, just like in Maya, these sliders can go further than they are set to default. So I'm going to try -2. And you can see at -2 I've got what I'm looking for. If you're wondering why it's red instead of white like it was in Maya, that's just because it's attached in Arnold, or sorry, in Nuke. Once Arnold renders and copies the data over to the depth channel, it actually only stores it in the red channel of depth. And to prove that, if we go to the RGB values up here, which allows you to switch between the channels of the currently selected layer, you can see if I go to red, there it is, exactly like it looked in Maya. It's white, grayscale with the foggy effect as the depth gets nearer to the camera. If I go to green and blue, you can see they're both blank. So because green and blue are blank, red has data. If you look at RGB, which is all three of these together, you're going to have red and an absence of green and blue, which means it's going to render as red. So that's normal. Again, don't panic. As long as you can see it, you've got your exposure plugged into the depth, and you're adjusting the depth value, you should be fine. You won't have any issues. So again, don't panic if it's red. So this is just to confirm that the data is there, and now that makes this kind of our starting point for our ZDepth. So once we've got that done, we don't want to stay in this mode, so I'm going to switch my depth channel back to the default RGBA. Just being confident now that my depth does live inside this file. Unplug that from the viewer. So how do I get that depth to affect this? How do I get it to adjust the depth of field setting that I'm trying to, again, which fakes the lens phenomena you get in a real camera with a lens that has a shallow depth of field or a shallow focus area. And it gives you the ability to have one area of the image in focus and either a foreground or background area, or both, blurry. In order to do that, we do need a couple of nodes, new nodes. One, if I hit the tab key to bring in my bring up my type inbox again, I'm looking for ZDEF. If you type that in, it'll filter out to the Z defocus filter node, and this node is essentially designed to work with a ZDepth to give you a that focus and blur option that you would get with the real lens in a real camera if you had the correct lens. So I'm going to choose Z defocus, and the way this node works, ignore filter. Filter is an optional node. You can plug that in to get different lens effects on your highlights. Again, for now we don't need to worry about that. The one we're most concerned about is image. Now the problem is I've only got one pipe here for image, and I've got two different things. I've got my background image, which is what I want to see, and I've got my ZDepth, which I want to affect it. So I can't plug this into both, so I need to combine my ZDepth and my background together in one node before I can plug it into the Z defocus. I'm going to move this down and out of the way for now. To do that, we're going to need to use a variation of a node we've looked at before, which is the shuffle node. We're going to use what's called shuffle copy. So I'm going to hit tab, type in shuffle. We've used the shuffle before, but we haven't used the shuffle copy variants yet. And the only difference between shuffle and shuffle copy is that shuffle copy allows you to combine channels from two different nodes. Simple as that. Shuffle allows you to rearrange the channels in a single node, whereas shuffle copy allows you to rearrange the channels in two nodes and essentially bring two nodes data together. Well, we want to see the car as is. We want to see our background comp as the default. So whatever you want to be the background in a shuffle copy should be plugged into 2. And we want to add the node or the ZDepth channel from this area, these nodes over here, into the ZDepth channel of our background, or again, our car render. So whatever has the channels that you want to add, so in this case the ZDepth, goes plugged into 1. If I'm being totally honest, you could actually flip those. It'll work both ways. It would just change how you had to set the settings over here in the right hand view. But for me, I've always essentially plugged it in with this order. So again, the one that I want to see, the one that I want to add the data to, goes into channel 2, and the one that I want to pull the data from goes into channel 1. So with that done, I'm actually going to plug the shuffle copy into my viewer. And you can see nothing changes here. And that's because I've already plugged this in. If I unplug 2, it would go blank, because the viewer is plugged into the shuffle copy, and as I already said, pipe 2 defines what it sees by default. So if I plug that back in, there we go, we've got an image. Now at this point nothing's really changed. If I come over here to my drop down, this current node that we have, based on everything we've done so far, has RGB, RGBA, and alpha information, and that's it. I don't see depth listed here. We know the depth exists here, and we've plugged it into the shuffle copy, so how come we don't see it yet? That's because we haven't changed our settings yet. We've got both decks plugged in, both deck of virtual cards represented by the channels, but we actually haven't shuffled the decks together yet. We've just got them kind of sitting side by side. So we want the depth channel. So what we're going to do, and we only want to affect the depth channel, we don't want to change anything else. So I'm going to take my input, which is pipe 1, which we know is plugged into ZDepth, and the input is going to be depth. So the depth only shows up if it exists, which obviously it does. So I'm going to choose depth. And then the output, I don't want to change RGB and alpha. That's what we've got here, and that's exactly what we want. I want to see this as is, so I don't want to accidentally rearrange any of those bits of information. Hypothetically, I could plug the depth into the alpha, but I'm not going to. I'm going to actually specify and create the depth channel here as well. So I'm going to go to the output drop down. So again, these 1 in, 2 in represent the input for each of these two nodes, 1 and 2. The output is the output of the shuffle, so it's the combined output. So right now it's going to output RGBA. If I switch this to depth, what's going to happen is it's going to automatically pass through the RGBA data from 2 untouched. It's not going to change it. However, my ZDepth will now be remapped based on whatever I choose here. So as it is right now, what it's going to do for what it's going to use for depth, if you look, all you got to do is follow these arrows down till you hit an X. Here, no X. So that means this data is not going to be piped through. No X, no X, no X, no X, no X. So none of these, if there was data here, none of it will be used right now. So I'm going to come into my 2 input and follow down until I hit an X. So if in the red channel you can see, boom, there's an X. So what it's going to be doing right now is it's going to take the red information from this image and remap that to the depth channel. That's not what we want. We want the ZDepth from our 1 input to be mapped. So all we got to do is change the position of this X. Right now it's taking the data from channel 2 in the red channel and piping it out as Z. We want to move that X over here. So it's going to click on it. And the X can't be 2 places in at once, so you can see that it automatically removes the X from here. So now if I follow the input, it's inputting Z, I hit the X, and then change directions and come across, and it's getting output as Z in the depth channel. So let's have a look. So with the copy, the shuffle copy plugged in, I'm now going to come back over here, and you can see depth is now available. And if I plug in depth and have a look, you can see there's my alpha. There is one problem still, however. Notice the depth is not lining up with the RGBA. It's bigger and it's offset. That's because if we zoom out and look at this, once I plug the depth in, see how I get this dashed frame here and it says 1920 by 1080? My comp was originally set up for 720p, so 1280 by 720. I actually rendered out my depth at a higher resolution. It was rendered at 1920 by 1080, so they don't line up when you bring them together. What Nuke will automatically do in a situation like that is crop it. We'll just line up 0, 0 of the XY coordinates to the bottom left-hand corner, fit that in best it can, and crop it. So it's not gonna work. It's not gonna fit. So whenever you're bringing data of different sizes together, different resolutions, you got to make sure you reformat the off-size data. So you got a choice: do I reformat the 720p footage up to 1920, or do I reformat the 1920 footage down to 720? In the ZDepth video in Maya, I mentioned that it's often common practice to render out the ZDepth higher resolution than needed, and then resample it down to kind of smooth it out a little bit. So that's kind of what I've done here. I've intentionally rendered it at 1920, knowing that I'd like to resample it to obviously make it fit, and and then B, to hopefully smooth out the renderer just a little bit so it's not quite as jagged as it is right now. And by jagged, if I zoom in and see, you can see all the jagged edges here. It's not filtered. They don't do any blurring or filtering or anti-aliasing really on depth passes. Normally it's not an issue, but depending on what your comp is doing, you may or may not need to blur that a little bit yourself. But sampling it is one way to kind of blur it very subtly. So let's go ahead and sample it. So in Nuke, to resize footage, you need to create what's called a reformat node. So I'm going to hit tab, type in REFORMAT. You've got two that pop up here, reformat and deep reformat. Deep reformat is a very specific type of compositing, which we're not doing right here, so we're just going to use the basic reformat node. And you can see if I look at the settings up here, the default is 1280 by 720. It didn't pull that from nowhere. If I go back to my project settings for a second, which is the S key, I've already set early on, when I built the original parts of this project, I already set my full-size project format to 1280 by 720. So whenever you recreate or create a format node, a reformat node, it's going to automatically choose that resolution. If you want to make it a different size, you can make it custom, or you can just choose one of the presets that are here. But by default, it will just pull the data from whatever your project setting is set to, which is fine. So with that set up, I'm going to plug the reformat in between my shuffle copy and my ZDepth pipe, whatever the final node is. It doesn't really matter. Where it actually could go before here too. It'll work either way. So I'm going to put it just before the shuffle copy, and that should instantly make it fit. Because I'm going from 1920 by 1080 down to 720, they're the same aspect ratio, so I don't have to worry about it getting squished or stretched or anything like that. Now, and look what happens in doing that. Remember the jagged edges we had before? They're still jagged, but if you look at it, see how there's different gradations now? Anytime you resample an image down, it resamples everything, including the aliased edges. And it's a way to subtly add an aliased edge or a softer edge to a ZDepth without actually blurring it. So again, the larger you make it, the more sampled and feathered it'll be when you shrink it down. So if I wanted to make it a little bit more of a subtle filter, then maybe I'd render it out at 4K instead of 1K or 2K. As long as it's larger and you resample it, it'll always give you that effect. So that's something that I usually do myself. It's not required for the assignment, but if you did render out at a different resolution, you will get that. For you guys, if you're just using the default settings and didn't set that specifically, most likely your ZDepth will come out the same resolution as what you had already, which is fine. but if not, the reformat node will get you there. So as always, I should be labeling these. So ZDepth, reformat, and I'm going to call the shuffle copy add ZDepth shuffle copy. So this is the shuffle that's adding the ZDepth to the equation. So now I've got a single node. I'm going to just move this down so it's obvious. This single shuffle copy node now contains the end result of this with this depth added to it. So that's exactly what I need for the final part, which is activating and bringing in my ZDefocus. Now my ZDefocus has something to work with. It's got both the background image and depth information combined into one singular node. Not a bad idea, I think, in my opinion, to add the thumbnail to this. So I'm going to come over to the node tab, turn on the postage stamp, and again, just a visual thing, but I like to see it. And finally, I've got my ZDefocus. I'm going to add that after the shuffle copy, so it's the very last thing that's happening. And I'm going to bring up its settings. And by default, what it should do is it should pick the depth channel as depth Z, which is actually exactly what we want. That's why we put it in the depth channel. That's what it looks for with the default settings. So now everything probably will be extremely blurry. That's okay. Now we need to adjust this. So a lot of nodes in Nuke, especially kind of visual effect nodes like this, depending on how it's processed, they will have the this output function where the result is what you're seeing by default, but there's also a couple of diagnostic tools as well. The one that's most useful for what we're doing right now is the focal plane setup. So go ahead and turn that on. Now everything's going to turn red, which is fine because we haven't changed any settings yet. But what will happen is, once we've got this adjusted, we'll be able to see visually, based on a diagnostic color, where the focus area is going to be, because it's going to turn green. So first thing you want to do is see this focal point. This determines what the camera is looking at and what you want to base your settings on. So it makes sense for us to choose the car or a part of the car. I'll put the focal point right on the side of the car right here. And instantly, as soon as you move that, we get a change. So essentially, if I switch back to end result now, you can see all of a sudden I've got this partially blurred and partially not blurred effect where everything in front of the focal point, or if we look at the focal plane setup, everything in blue will be in focus, everything in red will be out of focus. Now with the default settings, obviously the car itself is kind of half and half, so part of the car is in focus, part isn't. We can adjust the settings here to really kind of take control of what's happening there. I also recommend for the math, for for Maya and Arnold, lost for words there for a second, trying to figure out which renderer I'm using. But for Maya and Arnold, the best setting for math is the depth setting. So I'm going to go ahead and choose depth. So you can see that kind of flips it. If I go to result, you can see it definitely looks different now. Now the background is more blurry, the car is not as blurry, but the effect is a little bit more subtle now. So now with that done, now we'll start adjusting it. So again, default settings, if you've set everything up correctly, your depth channel should be set to Z, your math should be set to depth, and for diagnostic and setup, you want to set your result to focal plane. Now within that, you've got some options. So focal point determines where the camera is looking to pick its depth information from. So this is actually using the ZDepth to map the depth of the scene based on that grayscale image we rendered out of Maya. So different points of the car will give me different starting points. So if I, for example, want just the tire and the wheel in focus, I can do that by selecting a focal point on the wheel. So the focus point determines where the camera is pointed. The focus plane allows you to then slide the plane interactively without moving the focal point forwards and backwards throughout the scene. So it uses the focal point as a anchor, more or less, and that allows you to, again, bring the focus further, closer, or further away. And it's interactive, which is the beauty, the best part of about this setup. And then finally, we've got the depth of field. So this is really what gives you that range I was talking about earlier. If I bring this up, you can see this green band starts to grow. So the green band is going to be fully in focus. So if I want the whole car to be in focus, I make sure the band covers it. So once you've got your green band set, again, the focus plane allows you to adjust where that band sits within the world. So if you do want the focus to change and have the car partially out of focus, you would adjust that accordingly. And then finally, you've got size and maximum. That is essentially how blurry it is. So this will be more obvious if I go back to result mode. So right now I've got my band set, so green's in focus, and let's just see what happens as we adjust everything else. So I'm going to switch back to the result, and I'm going to start adjusting these values here. So I'm going to bring the maximum way up, and I'm going to bring my size way up, and that'll start to instantly blur. So now what I end up with is this kind of almost ethereal image, but it allows me to give me this professional look that you normally don't get with a regular camera. And the way it blurs, by the way, is very optically accurate. See how the bands of the painted lines in the street, see how they kind of widen out? It's exactly what would happen with a real camera lens. So it is something that they've done a really good job with how that calculates, and it actually turns out looking really, really realistic. Now, do I want to push it this far? Not necessarily. I just wanted to make sure you guys could see what that blurred effect looked like. So if I go back to diagnostic mode for a second, focal plane setup. So green's in focus, blue and red are both gradations of out of focus. So if I want all the foreground in focus and none of the background, I would have to change my focal plane to make it larger and include both the foreground and the car. So right now, if I look back at final result, the car should be blurry. The closer it is to the camera, the sharper it'll be. And another awesome thing about these settings is that it's fully keyable. You can animate these and have them change over time and get some really interesting camera effects. And again, it's all based on where the focal point is located. So if I move the focal point around, if you go look at it in focal plane, that's going to change where that green band begins and ends. So again, depth of field makes the green band wider or narrower. So right now only this part of the car will be in focus. So you get some pretty cool effects just by adjusting those values. Right here, I can really narrow down the depth of field, so everything will be blurry except for the wheel. So that is pretty much rendering and setting up ZDepth for use inside of Nuke, and again, rendering it using Arnold. It's a pretty simple process. Once you've done it once, it never changes. The only thing that may differ is if you're using a different renderer to create your ZDepth information. Maybe you're using Mental Ray or Redshift or something else. Then the process of Maya to generate the map might be slightly different. And then here your math setting could be different depending on the renderer, but the documentation for each renderer will generally tell you, or there's usually a documentation for Nuke might tell you what the best choice would be, but the information is definitely out there. So I'm going to leave this one here. If you do the same with your comp, again, either before or after you've done your color changes, really, as long as the ZD focus is the very last thing that you add, whatever your final node is previously, you just add ZD focus to the end, and this effect should work as long as you've got your shuffle node adding the depth to your final node properly.